Captain Marcus Fields was the kind of leader many in the community admired, but some within the force loathed. Rising through the ranks as a black officer in a predominantly white precinct, he had spent years proving himself in ways his white colleagues never had to. He couldn't afford mistakes. Every decision, every move he made was scrutinized more than most. On the surface, the precinct operated like any other. Badges polished, paperwork filed, morning briefings filled with routine banter. But Marcus knew better. Beneath the veneer of camaraderie, there was a deep undercurrent of racial tension, a divide that reared its head in subtle ways. A joke made too loudly in the locker room, the quiet side eyes when he was promoted, the constant implication that his achievements were the result of affirmative action rather than merit. No one embodied this resentment more than Detective Gary Hendricks. A 20-year veteran of the force, Gary had grown comfortable with the unspoken hierarchy of race and authority. To him, Marcus's promotion to captain wasn't just an insult. It was an affront to everything Gary believed about how the world should work. Guess they needed to check a box, Gary had muttered the day Marcus's promotion was announced, loud enough for half the precinct to hear. Gary had weathered complaints before, excessive force, inappropriate remarks, but they always seemed to vanish into the bureaucratic ether. His connections ran deep, from the local police union to city officials who valued his loyalty. Marcus, however, was a threat, not just because he outranked Gary, but because he demanded accountability and stood for a vision of policing that Gary despised. The tipping point came during a department meeting 2 weeks earlier. Marcus had pushed for a review of stop and frisk policies after a surge in complaints from Black and Latino residents. "We're here to protect and serve, not profile and harass," Marcus had said firmly, his voice cutting through the room. Gary's jaw tightened. "Sometimes you gotta do what it takes to get the job done," he countered, his tone laced with defiance. "It's not about what it takes, Hendricks," Marcus shot back. "It's about doing the right thing." The room fell silent. Marcus's words lingered, a challenge to the unspoken rules Gary had operated by for decades. 2 weeks later, Marcus found himself standing in the cold, fluorescent-lit evidence room, flanked by Gary and Linda Chavez from Internal Affairs. "Captain Fields," Linda began, her voice measured but firm. "We've received a report of missing funds from last week's narcotics seizure." Marcus's brow furrowed. "Missing funds?" Linda held up a grainy surveillance photo. The timestamp indicated the footage was from the previous night. The image showed a man in a police uniform entering the evidence room. "This was pulled from last night's security feed," she said. Marcus squinted at the photo. "That's supposed to be me?" he asked incredulously. "It's clear enough," Gary chimed in, his tone almost gleeful. "You were seen entering the evidence locker after hours, Captain. Care to explain why?" Marcus's chest tightened. He had been at the precinct late the night before, but not anywhere near the evidence room. He'd returned after a community meeting to prepare notes for an upcoming council presentation. "This is a mistake," Marcus said firmly. "I wasn't in the evidence room." Gary leaned in, his smirk widening. "Mistake or not, the footage doesn't lie. And $25,000 in cash doesn't just walk away on its own." Marcus's fists clenched at his sides. He looked to Linda, hoping for a fair hearing, but her expression remained neutral, unreadable. "This is serious, Captain," Linda said. "Until we can sort this out, I'm afraid we'll need you to step down temporarily." "Step down?" Marcus repeated, his voice rising. "It's protocol," Linda replied. "We need to maintain public trust." Public trust. The words rang hollow. Marcus had spent years working to build trust between the department and the community, and now it was crumbling in an instant, on the back of a flimsy accusation. Gary's grin grew wider. "Gotta admit, Captain, this doesn't look good." Marcus met his gaze. "I see what this is," he said quietly, his voice heavy with restrained anger. "This isn't about evidence or protocol. It's about people like you not wanting to see people like me succeed." Gary's smirk faltered for a moment before he recovered. "People like me? Careful, Captain. Wouldn't want to sound divisive." Marcus turned to Linda. "I demand a deeper investigation. This footage is doctored, and I can prove it." Linda hesitated. "We'll review everything thoroughly," she said, but her tone suggested she doubted him. The precinct's hallway buzzed as Marcus walked out of the evidence room. Officers whispered in clusters, their eyes darting toward him before quickly looking away. Marcus felt the weight of every stare, every muttered word. In his office, he sat down heavily, his mind racing. The evidence against him wasn't just weak, it was manufactured. But why? And how deep did this conspiracy run? The memory of Gary's smirk lingered. This was personal, yes, but it was also systemic. Marcus had challenged a culture of complacency and bias, and now the system was pushing back with all its might. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. "Terrence," he said when his brother answered. "I need your help. Someone's trying to take me down." Terrence, a tech-savvy civil rights advocate, had warned Marcus about this before. "You don't play by their rules, and they'll find a way to make you pay," he'd said. Now those words echoed in Marcus's mind as he prepared for the fight of his life. The 6th Precinct wasn't just a workplace, it was a microcosm of the larger struggles playing out in American society. The neighborhood it served was predominantly Black and Latino, a mix of working-class families and younger generations pushing for social change. Marcus Fields had grown up just a few blocks away, raised by a single mother who juggled 2 jobs to keep a roof over their heads. He had joined the force with a simple mission: to make a difference in the very streets where he had once played basketball with friends who later fell victim to gang violence or incarceration. For Marcus, the uniform was a symbol of hope, a way to bridge the gap between the community and the police. But it didn't take long for him to realize that not everyone in the precinct shared his vision. The old guard, as they were called, viewed the neighborhood with suspicion, seeing its residents more as potential criminals than as citizens to protect. Gary Hendricks was a poster child for the old guard. Born into a family of police officers, Gary had inherited the badge as much as he had earned it. His father, a decorated officer from the 1970s, often bragged about the good old days when they didn't have to worry about political correctness. Gary had internalized that worldview, seeing himself as the gatekeeper of a bygone era. To Gary, Marcus represented everything that was wrong with the new police force. Too much focus on sensitivity training, too little on real policing. Gary often mocked the community outreach programs Marcus championed, dismissing them as PR stunts. He wasn't shy about sharing his thoughts either, especially among like-minded colleagues in the precinct. But Marcus was no stranger to adversity. His journey to captain had been marked by battles both subtle and overt. Early in his career, he'd been paired with a training officer who joked about how Black officers were lucky to be hired. Later, he'd been passed over for promotions despite his spotless record, watching less qualified white colleagues ascend instead. His promotion to captain came after a civil rights group highlighted the department's glaring lack of diversity in leadership, a fact that Gary and others never let him forget. The precinct itself was a battleground. In one corner, you had officers like Marcus and a handful of younger recruits who genuinely wanted to rebuild trust with the community. In the other, you had the old guard, resistant to change and emboldened by figures like Gary. And in the middle were officers who didn't openly pick sides but leaned toward whoever held the most power at any given moment. Linda Chavez, the internal affairs officer assigned to Marcus's case, was one of those in the middle. A career-oriented professional, she had risen through the ranks by staying neutral and avoiding controversy. To her, Marcus's case was just another assignment, but the weight of it made her uneasy. She'd seen how quickly the department could close ranks to protect its own, even at the expense of justice. The day after the accusation, Marcus sat in his car outside the precinct, watching the early morning bustle. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the window. It was Officer Jamal Rivers, a young recruit who had joined the force inspired by Marcus's leadership. "Captain, are you okay?" Jamal asked, his voice tinged with concern. Marcus forced a smile. "Just thinking, Rivers. Long day ahead." Jamal hesitated. "You know, some of us have your back. Not everyone's buying what Hendricks is selling." "Thanks, Jamal, that means a lot," Marcus replied, though the weight in his chest didn't lift. Inside the precinct, Gary was holding court in the break room, regaling a group of officers with his version of events. "It's not personal," he said, his tone dripping with mock sincerity. "But if you can't trust your captain to follow the rules, how can you trust him to lead?" A few officers chuckled uncomfortably, while others nodded in agreement. The message was clear. Marcus's credibility was being systematically dismantled, and Gary was pulling the strings. Meanwhile, Marcus began piecing together the threads of the conspiracy. He reviewed the surveillance footage on his own time, noticing subtle inconsistencies, a shadow that didn't align, a timestamp that seemed off by mere milliseconds. He brought his brother Terrence into the fold, knowing his expertise in digital forensics could uncover what Marcus couldn't. "This isn't just about you, Mark," Terrence said after examining the footage. "This is about control. They want to make an example out of you because you're changing the system." Marcus nodded grimly. "I'm not backing down, not this time." As Marcus dug deeper, he found allies in unexpected places. Officer Maria Sanchez, a veteran who had kept her head down for years, approached him quietly one evening. "I've seen things, Captain," she said. "Things that Gary's done. He thinks he's untouchable, but he's sloppy. If you're serious about fighting this, I can help." Maria's words were a glimmer of hope in an otherwise bleak situation. Marcus realized that the fight ahead wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about exposing a culture of corruption and bias that had poisoned the precinct for years. The morning after Linda Chavez officially placed Marcus on administrative leave, news of the investigation hit the local media. Headlines blared with sensationalism. "Captain Fields under investigation for missing funds," and "Scandal rocks the 6th precinct." The stories painted Marcus as a rising star with a shadowy secret, feeding off whispers and half-truths leaked by Gary's network within the department. Marcus sat at his kitchen table, scrolling through the articles. Each word felt like a blade slicing away at his reputation. His phone buzzed incessantly, reporters seeking comments, community members expressing disbelief, and a few officers offering quiet words of support. Among the texts was one from his mother. "You've been through worse, baby. You'll get through this." Her faith in him was unshakable, but Marcus felt the weight of her belief as both a comfort and a burden. Meanwhile, Gary's campaign against Marcus gained momentum. At the precinct, he positioned himself as the reluctant whistleblower, spinning a narrative of duty and integrity. "I didn't want to do this," he told anyone who would listen. "But rules are rules, and no one's above them, not even a captain." Officers who once admired Marcus now hesitated, unsure of where their loyalties should lie. Fear of retaliation, both institutional and social, kept many silent. Marcus's allies were few, and those who stood by him, like Jamal and Maria, did so discreetly, knowing the risks. The conflict escalated when Marcus received a call from Terrence. "Mark, I've analyzed the footage," Terrence said, his voice urgent. "It's been tampered with, no doubt. The shadows don't align, and the metadata shows edits. Whoever did this wasn't sloppy, but they weren't perfect either." "Can you prove it?" Marcus asked, hope flickering in his voice. "I can," Terrence replied, "but we need access to the original files. What you sent me was a secondary copy. Whoever doctored this is covering their tracks." Marcus sighed, leaning back in his chair. "That means someone in the precinct, or close to it, is involved. And not just Gary," Terrence added. "This feels bigger than him. Be careful." As Marcus strategized his next move, Gary ramped up his efforts. A city council hearing was called to address the growing scandal, and Marcus was subpoenaed to testify. The hearing was a spectacle, broadcast live on local TV. Gary, smug and composed, sat among the audience, his presence a silent reminder of the stakes. During the hearing, Marcus spoke with measured determination. "I've served this city for 15 years with honor and integrity," he said. "I categorically deny the accusations against me, and I have evidence that this investigation is rooted in manipulation and deceit." A council member leaned forward. "Captain Fields, are you suggesting that members of your own precinct are conspiring against you?" "I'm not suggesting," Marcus replied firmly. "I'm stating it as fact. The evidence presented against me has been falsified, and I intend to prove it." The room erupted into murmurs. Gary, watching from the back, clenched his jaw. Marcus's defiance was a threat to the narrative he'd carefully crafted. After the hearing, Marcus met with Jamal and Maria in a quiet diner on the edge of town. "I've got proof that the footage was doctored," Marcus said, lowering his voice. "But I need access to the original files to make it stick." Maria nodded. "I can get you that access. But if anyone finds out, my career is over." "You're putting yourself on the line for this," Marcus said. Maria's gaze was steady. "Because this isn't just about you, Captain. It's about all of us. If they can do this to you, they can do it to anyone." Jamal chimed in. I'll keep watch while Maria gets the files. We'll do this together. As the plan took shape, Marcus couldn't ignore the growing tension in the city. Community protests had begun to form outside the precinct, with residents demanding transparency and justice. Signs reading "Justice for Marcus" and "Accountability Now" filled the streets. Inside the precinct, Gary watched the protests with disdain. "Look at this circus," he muttered to his colleagues, all because someone couldn't keep their hands clean. But Gary's confidence began to waver as Marcus's determination became clearer. The captain's allies were few but resourceful, and cracks in Gary's facade started to show. Maria's quiet investigation uncovered irregularities in the precinct's internal systems, deleted files, manipulated logs, and suspicious access patterns that pointed to a coordinated effort to frame Marcus. One night, as Maria copied critical files onto a flash drive, the tension boiled over. "Hey!" barked Officer Daniels, one of Gary's loyalists, catching her in the act. "What are you doing?" Maria froze, her heart pounding. Thinking quickly, she replied, "Captain's orders. He asked me to pull some old case files for review." Daniels narrowed his eyes. "Didn't think you were still taking orders from him." Maria shrugged. "A job's a job." After an agonizing pause, Daniels walked away. Maria exhaled sharply and quickly finished copying the files. The next day, Terrence reviewed the data Maria had recovered. "This is it," he said. "This proves the footage was altered. There are traces of the original file buried in the system, enough to show the tampering." Marcus felt a surge of relief but knew the battle wasn't over. The evidence was damning, but presenting it would make him an even bigger target. "We need to move carefully," he said. "Gary won't go down without a fight." The investigation into Marcus Fields continued to spiral, but it was no longer just about him. The scandal had cracked open a Pandora's box of grievances and tensions within the precinct and the city itself. Outside the precinct, protests had grown from a few dozen voices to hundreds. Community organizers joined forces, using Marcus's case as a rallying cry against systemic corruption and racial injustice. "Justice for Captain Fields" was now painted across banners, chanted in marches, and trending on social media. But not everyone in the department was pleased with the attention. Behind closed doors, precinct meetings became increasingly tense. Interim leadership, eager to quell the storm, began enforcing stricter rules. "No officer is to speak to the press," Acting Captain McGregor ordered during one meeting, his eyes scanning the room. Gary Hendricks, seated at the back, smirked. He had become a polarizing figure even within his own ranks. To some, he was a whistleblower doing what needed to be done. To others, he was a bully exploiting a situation to settle personal scores. Marcus's support network continued to grow in unexpected ways. Jamal Rivers and Maria Sanchez remained steadfast, but new allies began emerging. Officer Anika Patel, a meticulous detective known for her discretion, approached Marcus with a file she'd quietly assembled over the years. "This is everything I've got on Gary," Anika said, handing over the folder during a covert meeting at a public park. Inside were years of complaints, allegations of excessive force, coercion of witnesses, and even rumors of ties to a local business owner under federal investigation for money laundering. "Why didn't you report this sooner?" Marcus asked, his voice low. Anika sighed. "You think I didn't try? These complaints always disappeared before they got anywhere. But if you're fighting this, I'm in. Gary's had too much power for too long." Meanwhile, Terrence Fields made a breakthrough while analyzing the data Maria had retrieved. Hidden among the altered files were traces of an encrypted communication log. "This isn't just one person framing you, Mark," Terrence explained. "It's a coordinated effort. Someone with serious technical skills is involved." The encrypted messages hinted at a connection to external parties, possibly tied to a shady local contractor who had been supplying the precinct with equipment for years. "This isn't just about you," Terrence concluded. "This is about money, influence, and silencing anyone who threatens the system." Marcus knew time was running out. The city council was pressuring the department to resolve the case quickly, and Gary's narrative was starting to solidify in the public eye. But the stakes rose even higher when Maria received an anonymous tip. "I don't know who it was," Maria told Marcus, handing him a manila envelope, "but someone inside wants you to see this." Inside were photographs showing Gary in a compromising meeting with the local contractor, none other than Howard Greaves, the business owner, Terrence, had flagged. The photos showed them exchanging envelopes, the contents of which were unclear but suspicious. "This proves he's dirty," Maria said. "Not yet," Marcus replied. "But it's a start. We need more than photos to expose him, and the whole network behind him." As Marcus and his allies dug deeper, tensions within the precinct reached a boiling point. Officers who had once stayed neutral began choosing sides. Quiet murmurs of discontent spread among the ranks. If they can frame the captain, what's stopping them from coming after us next? The breaking point came when Gary confronted Jamal in the locker room. "You've been awfully chummy with Fields lately," Gary said, his voice low but threatening. Jamal didn't flinch. "I stand by what's right." "That's what this job is supposed to be about." Gary stepped closer, his tone sharpening. "You think you're a hero, kid? You'll learn the hard way that loyalty is everything in this job, and you're on the wrong side of it." The encounter left Jamal shaken, but resolute. He reported the incident to Marcus, who knew it was a sign that Gary was feeling the pressure. The conflict spilled out onto the streets when a protest outside the precinct turned chaotic. Counter-protesters, many waving flags and chanting slogans supportive of law enforcement, clashed with Marcus's supporters. The confrontation escalated, drawing national attention. Amid the chaos, Marcus received another blow. The department issued a formal statement. "Captain Fields remains under investigation. We are committed to ensuring a fair and thorough process, but we urge the public to remain patient and respectful of the rule of law." The statement was a clear attempt to placate both sides, but it left Marcus feeling more isolated than ever. That night, he gathered his team, Terrence, Jamal, Maria, and now Annika, at his home. "We're close," Marcus said, spreading the photos and files across the table. "But close isn't enough. We need to expose this in a way they can't ignore." Terrence nodded. "The encrypted logs are the key. If we can decrypt them, we'll have proof of who's behind this and why." Maria added, "And we need to time it right. If we release this too soon, they'll bury it, but if we wait too long, they'll destroy the evidence." The team worked late into the night, each piece of the puzzle bringing them closer to the truth. But as they closed in, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. The walls were closing in on both sides. For Marcus, the evidence against Gary and the larger conspiracy was mounting, but so was the pressure to act decisively. For Gary, cracks were forming in the fortress he had carefully built, and desperation was beginning to show. The turning point came on a Thursday evening, when Marcus received an anonymous email. The subject line read, "You're closer than you think. Meet me at Pier 42 at midnight." Attached was a snippet of decrypted communication from the encrypted logs Terrence had been working on. The message read, "Ensure Fields is discredited before the council review. Greaves expects confirmation by Friday." Marcus's mind raced. Was this a trap, or was it the break he needed? He forwarded the message to Terrence, who called within minutes. "This is legit," Terrence said, "but it's risky as hell. If it's a setup, they'll be ready for you." Marcus considered his options. The safer play was to hand the message over to Internal Affairs or even a trusted journalist, but that would mean relinquishing control and potentially exposing his allies. "I'll go," Marcus said, "but I'm not going alone." At 11:45 p.m., Marcus parked his car a block away from Pier 42, a desolate stretch of the city's waterfront. The air was thick with tension as he adjusted the small recording device clipped beneath his jacket. Jamal and Maria were stationed nearby, their presence a silent reassurance. "If anything happens, we call for backup immediately," Maria said, her voice firm. Marcus nodded and stepped into the darkness. The pier was quiet except for the soft lapping of water against the docks. A single figure emerged from the shadows, their face obscured by a hood. "You came alone," the figure said, their voice distorted by a modulator. Marcus nodded, keeping his distance. "You've got information for me, let's hear it." The figure extended a flash drive. "Everything you need is on here. Financial records, communications, names. This goes all the way to the top." "Why are you helping me?" Marcus asked, his voice steady. The figure hesitated. "Because I'm tired of covering for them, and because you're the only one willing to stand up to them." Before Marcus could respond, headlights flooded the pier. A black SUV screeched to a halt and 4 men in plainclothes jumped out, guns drawn. "Police, hands where I can see them," one of the men barked. The figure bolted, tossing the flash drive to Marcus, who caught it instinctively. Chaos erupted as the men pursued the informant, leaving Marcus momentarily alone. "Captain, move!" Maria's voice crackled over his earpiece. Marcus turned and ran, his heart pounding. He sprinted toward the far end of the pier, where Jamal was waiting in a getaway car. The flash drive was clutched tightly in his hand, his only hope of exposing the truth. Back at Marcus's house, the team worked frantically to access the files on the flash drive. Terrence's fingers flew across the keyboard as he decrypted the data. "This is it," Terrence said, his voice tinged with awe. "Financial records showing Greaves paid over $200,000 to Gary and 2 other officers. Communications tying them to tampered evidence in your case, and—" He paused. "Holy hell, there are even bribes to city officials." Marcus exhaled slowly, the weight of the discovery settling in. "We've got them," he said. But their victory was short-lived. Minutes later, Maria's phone buzzed with a text from a precinct contact. "Gary knows you're involved. Watch your back." The stakes had never been higher. With the evidence in hand, Marcus knew they had to act immediately. "We go public," he said. "Tonight." At 3 a.m., Marcus uploaded the files to a secure server and shared them with a trusted journalist, Angela Kane, who had long reported on police corruption. "This is explosive," Angela said after reviewing the documents. "But you're going to make a lot of enemies." "I already have," Marcus replied. The story broke at dawn. Headlines screamed, "Police Captain Frames Colleague, Corruption Scandal Rocks Precinct, and City Officials Implicated in Evidence Tampering." Within hours, protests outside the precinct swelled to thousands. The mayor called an emergency press conference, promising a full investigation. Inside the precinct, Gary's composure finally cracked. He stormed into the locker room where Maria and Jamal were quietly celebrating their success. "This is on you," Gary shouted, pointing a finger at Maria. "You think you've won? You're finished. All of you." Maria stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "It's over, Gary. You should have thought about that before you tried to ruin an innocent man." Gary lunged at her, but Jamal intervened, pulling him back. "You're done," Jamal said, his voice steady, "and you know it." Later that day, Marcus stood before the city council again, this time with the evidence in hand. "This is more than a personal attack," Marcus said, addressing the council and a packed room of reporters. "This is about systemic corruption that has infected our department and this city. But today, we start to clean it up." The council erupted into applause, the sound a stark contrast to the silence that had greeted Marcus during his first testimony. As Gary was led away in handcuffs, Marcus allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, the scales were tipping in his favor. The revelations about Gary Hendricks and his network sent shockwaves through the city. The public outcry was immediate and intense. Protesters demanded not only the resignation of implicated officials, but also sweeping reforms to address the systemic issues exposed by the scandal. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was tense. Officers avoided eye contact as Marcus walked through the halls. His temporary reinstatement as captain met with a mixture of silent respect and lingering resentment. The department was under siege from both the media and the community, and everyone knew the fallout was far from over. Gary's arrest marked the first domino to fall. Investigators quickly expanded their probe, uncovering a trail of corruption that extended beyond the precinct. 2 other officers implicated in the conspiracy were suspended and faced charges, while the city council launched an independent audit of police contracts, starting with those linked to Howard Greaves. The mayor, once reluctant to engage, issued a public apology during a press conference. "We failed our citizens by allowing corruption to take root in our institutions," she said. "Captain Fields's courage in exposing these crimes is a reminder of what integrity looks like." But for Marcus, the victory was bittersweet. While the public rallied behind him, the battle had left scars. His name had been cleared, but the damage to his reputation lingered. There were still whispers among his peers, and he knew some would always view him with suspicion, not because of what he'd done, but because of what he represented. Outside the precinct, the mood was one of cautious optimism. Community leaders who had long criticized the police saw Marcus as a symbol of hope, a bridge between 2 worlds that often clashed. During a town hall meeting held a week after the scandal broke, Marcus addressed the crowd. "I didn't stand up because it was easy," he said. "I stood up because it was right, and I can't do this alone. If we want real change, It has to come from all of us. Officers, citizens, leaders. We have to work together to build trust and accountability. The room erupted into applause, but not everyone was convinced. In the back, a young activist named Darius stood, his arms crossed. "Words are great, Captain," Darius said, his voice carrying across the room. "But we've heard them before. How do we know this time will be different?" Marcus met his gaze. "Because this time, we're starting with transparency. My first act as reinstated captain will be to create an independent review board made up of community members. You'll have a say in how we operate." The announcement was met with murmurs of surprise, followed by applause. Darius nodded, though his expression remained skeptical. At home, Marcus tried to return to a sense of normalcy, but the experience had changed him. His brother, Terrence, visited one evening to check in. "You did it," Terrence said, handing Marcus a beer as they sat on the porch. "We did it," Marcus corrected, raising his bottle in a toast. "I couldn't have done this without you. And Maria, Jamal, Annika." Terrence grinned. "You've got a real Avengers team there." Marcus chuckled, but the laughter faded quickly. "It's not over," he said. "They'll try to fight back. Maybe not Gary, but the system he was part of. It doesn't just disappear overnight." Terrence nodded. "True, but you've got momentum now. Use it." Within the precinct, the shakeup was far from complete. Linda Chavez, the internal affairs officer, found herself at a crossroads. Her initial neutrality during Marcus's ordeal had earned her criticism from both sides. In a private meeting, Marcus confronted her. "You could have stopped this earlier," he said, his tone firm but not accusatory. Linda looked down, ashamed. "I followed protocol," she replied quietly, "but I see now that protocol wasn't enough." Marcus leaned forward. "Then help me fix it. You've seen the cracks in the system. Be part of the solution." Linda hesitated, then nodded. "I will." The scandal quickly became a national story, sparking debates about police reform across the country. Marcus was invited to speak at panels and forums, sharing his experience as both a victim of systemic corruption and a leader determined to change it from within. During an interview with a prominent news anchor, Marcus was asked, "What do you say to people who argue that one man can't change an institution as entrenched as the police?" He smiled thoughtfully. "One man alone can't, but one man can start a movement. And that's what I hope this is, a movement toward accountability, justice, and trust." Gary Hendrix's trial became a spectacle, with damning evidence laid bare for the public to see. His defense team tried to argue that he was a scapegoat, a victim of shifting political tides. But the jury didn't buy it. He was convicted on multiple counts of corruption, conspiracy, and evidence tampering. During sentencing, Marcus attended the hearing, sitting quietly in the back. As Gary was led away in handcuffs, he turned and locked eyes with Marcus. For a moment, there was no smirk, no bravado, just defeat. Marcus felt no triumph, only a deep sense of resolution. The precinct began implementing reforms, starting with the independent review board Marcus had proposed. Officers like Maria and Jamal took on leadership roles, helping to reshape the department's culture. For Marcus, the journey was far from over. He remained captain, but the job felt different now. The stakes were higher, the scrutiny more intense. But he was ready. On his desk sat a framed photo of his mother, a reminder of the values she had instilled in him: integrity, resilience, and the courage to do what was right, no matter the cost. As he prepared for another day, Marcus glanced out the window. The protests had quieted, but their impact lingered in the air. Change was slow, often painful, but it was happening, and for the first time in a long while, Marcus felt hope. The weeks following the trial were marked by cautious optimism, but Marcus Fields knew that lasting change would require more than public statements and reforms on paper. The battle he had fought exposed the fractures within the 6th Precinct and the police department at large. Repairing those fractures would be a slow, deliberate process, and Marcus was determined to see it through. The independent review board Marcus had proposed became a reality within a month. Comprised of community leaders, retired judges, and citizen volunteers, the board met weekly to review complaints, assess policies, and recommend reforms. Marcus made it clear to his officers, transparency wasn't just a buzzword, it was the new standard. Some officers resisted the changes, grumbling about outsiders meddling in police work. Marcus addressed the concerns head-on during a precinct-wide meeting. I know change is uncomfortable, he began, standing at the front of the room. But ask yourselves this: do you want to be part of a system that serves and protects, or one that divides and distrusts? This isn't about politics. It's about honor. And it's about doing the right thing, even when it's hard. His words struck a chord with many in the room, though not all. Officer Daniels, one of Gary's loyalists, muttered under his breath, "Easy for him to say." Marcus heard him but didn't react. He knew winning over skeptics would take time. Jamal Rivers and Maria Sanchez emerged as key figures in the precinct's transformation. Jamal's enthusiasm and dedication inspired younger recruits, while Maria's steady presence brought credibility to the new initiatives. One afternoon, Jamal approached Marcus with an idea. "Captain, we need to expand community policing programs," he said. "What if we had officers work directly with youth groups and schools, build relationships early instead of waiting until something goes wrong?" Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "I like it. Draft a proposal and let's present it to the review board. This is exactly the kind of proactive thinking we need." The program, dubbed Pathways to Trust, launched within weeks, pairing officers with local schools and community centers. The initiative faced skepticism at first, but as officers began mentoring students and participating in neighborhood events, the tension between police and residents began to ease. Despite the progress, Marcus's journey was far from smooth. The media spotlight made him a target for critics on both sides. Conservative commentators accused him of politicizing law enforcement, while some activists claimed his reforms didn't go far enough. One particularly heated confrontation occurred during a live town hall event. You talk about transparency, but where's the accountability for officers who've abused their power for years? A community activist demanded. Marcus met the question with calm resolve. Accountability isn't just about punishment. It's about prevention. That's why we're implementing new training programs, independent oversight, and stricter protocols. But I hear you, and I promise we won't stop until we've earned your trust. The exchange was broadcast widely, drawing both praise and criticism. Marcus wasn't deterred. He understood that change came with resistance, and every conversation, no matter how tense, was a step toward progress. Marcus's personal life also began to shift. The ordeal had deepened his relationship with his brother, Terrence, who became a constant source of support. The two often spent evenings strategizing over dinner, their bond stronger than it had been in years. "You know," Terrence said one night, "you're not just fixing the precinct. You're setting an example for departments across the country. People are watching. That's what scares me," Marcus admitted. "What if I screw it up?" Terrence laughed. "You? Nah, you're too stubborn to fail." The comment brought a rare smile to Marcus's face. Amid the progress, Marcus couldn't ignore the ghosts of the past. One afternoon, while reviewing old complaints with the review board, he came across a case file involving Officer Daniels. The allegations mirrored Gary's tactics: intimidation, fabricated evidence, and abuse of power. Marcus called Daniels into his office. "You've got a history, Daniels," Marcus said, sliding the file across the desk. "Care to explain why these complaints were buried?" Daniels squirmed. "Those were misunderstandings. You know how it is out there, Captain. Sometimes you have to—" "Don't finish that sentence," Marcus interrupted, his tone sharp. "You've got two choices. Start doing your job the right way or hand in your badge." Daniels stared at him for a long moment before nodding reluctantly. Understood. Marcus knew that not every officer would embrace reform, but he was prepared to draw a hard line. Months later, the precinct hosted a community event to celebrate the success of the Pathways to Trust program. Marcus stood on stage alongside Maria, Jamal, and members of the review board, addressing a crowd that had once marched in protest outside the precinct's doors. "This isn't just about a program," Marcus said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "It's about building a future where trust isn't the exception, it's the rule, and I'm proud to say we're getting there." The crowd erupted in applause, a tangible sign that progress was possible. The reforms Marcus Fields implemented had begun to take root, but the road ahead was far from smooth. While public sentiment leaned cautiously in his favor, Marcus knew the most significant battles were yet to come. The ripple effects of exposing Gary Hendrix's corruption were spreading, and those who had once benefited from the old system weren't going to let their influence slip away quietly. A week after the precinct's community event, Marcus received an anonymous letter in the mail. The words, written in bold black ink, were chilling. "You've made powerful enemies. Stop before it's too late." He read the note twice, then a third time, before folding it neatly and placing it in his desk drawer. Threats weren't new to him, but this one carried a weight that couldn't be ignored. Later that evening, Terrence noticed Marcus sitting on the porch, the note weighing on his mind. "What's going on?" Terrence asked, sitting beside him. Marcus handed him the letter. Terrence read it and frowned. "You need to take this seriously, Mark. People don't make threats like this unless they're feeling cornered." "I know," Marcus replied, "but I can't let it stop me. That's what they want." Terrence leaned back, his expression serious. "Just promise me you'll be careful. You've got too many people counting on you." Marcus nodded, the resolve in his heart hardening. The deeper investigations triggered by the Hendricks scandal began to reveal a sprawling web of corruption. Marcus worked closely with the Independent Review Board and city officials to uncover how far the rot extended. Among the findings were contracts awarded to Howard Greaves's company that stretched back nearly a decade. The contracts, worth millions, were riddled with irregularities, suggesting bribes and kickbacks involving multiple city departments. Maria Sanchez, now leading a special task force within the precinct, approached Marcus with an update one evening. "Captain, we've uncovered something big," she said, handing him a file. "Greaves's company has been tied to at least 5 precincts across the city, and the same names keep showing up in the records." Marcus flipped through the file, his eyes narrowing. "This isn't just about the 6th precinct. This is systemic." Maria nodded. "If we take this public, it's going to rattle some cages. Hard." Marcus exhaled slowly. "That's exactly what needs to happen." Word of the ongoing investigations began to leak, sparking both hope and fear. In the precinct, officers who had once stayed neutral now faced a choice: stand with Marcus and his reforms, or risk being swept up in the fallout. Officer Daniels, who had begrudgingly agreed to change his ways, found himself in a moral dilemma. Gary's old allies were pressuring him to stonewall the investigations, but the growing momentum of Marcus's leadership made resistance seem futile. One evening, Daniels approached Marcus in the parking lot after his shift. "Captain," Daniels began hesitantly, "there's something you should know." Marcus stopped and turned to face him. "Go on." Daniels shifted uncomfortably. "Some of Gary's old crew. They're still trying to cover their tracks. I heard them talking about getting rid of files before the auditors come through." Marcus's jaw tightened. "Did you see who?" Daniels nodded. "Yeah, I can give you names." The admission marked a turning point for Daniels. For the first time, Marcus saw a glimmer of integrity in the man's eyes. Armed with Daniels's information, Marcus and his team moved quickly. Maria led a late-night operation to secure evidence from a storage facility where sensitive records were being hidden. The team's efforts paid off when they uncovered boxes of documents detailing years of illegal activity, including a ledger that tied Greaves directly to several high-ranking city officials. Jamal, who had been stationed outside as lookout, radioed in as Maria emerged with the boxes. "We've got company," he said. A black SUV pulled up and 2 men stepped out, their expressions grim. "Who gave you authorization to be here?" one of them barked. Maria stood her ground, her badge visible. "This is an active investigation. Step aside." The men hesitated but didn't push further. Jamal watched them closely as they got back into their vehicle and sped away. The next morning, news of the storage facility raid hit the media. The documents recovered were being reviewed by federal investigators, and Marcus's name was once again in the headlines. But this time, the narrative was different. Captain Fields isn't just cleaning up his precinct, he's exposing corruption across the city, a reporter stated during a live broadcast. The pressure on city officials reached a boiling point. The mayor held another press conference, promising sweeping reforms and an independent investigation into all precincts implicated in the scandal. But not everyone was pleased. Marcus began receiving more threats, some subtle, others overt. One evening, as he left the precinct, he found his car vandalized. The words "traitor" spray-painted across the hood. Jamal, who had been leaving with him, saw the damage and clenched his fists. "This is cowardly," he said. Marcus put a hand on Jamal's shoulder. "It means we're making progress. They wouldn't fight this hard if they didn't feel threatened." With the evidence secured and public pressure mounting, Marcus prepared for the most critical step yet, a public hearing where he would present the findings to the city council and federal investigators. In the days leading up to the hearing, Marcus worked tirelessly, refining his testimony and coordinating with his allies. Terrence stayed by his side, offering advice and reminding him to stay grounded. "You've got this, Mark," Terrence said the night before the hearing. "This isn't just about the precinct anymore. It's about showing people that change is possible." Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of his brother's words. As he stood in his office that evening, looking out over the city, Marcus felt a mix of anticipation and resolve. The fight had tested him in ways he'd never imagined, but it had also shown him what was possible when integrity and determination met opportunity. Tomorrow, the fight would come to a head. The day of the public hearing arrived, and the city buzzed with anticipation. The events surrounding Marcus Fields and the corruption scandal had captivated not only the local community, but the entire nation. The hearing was set to be broadcast live, promising a day of high-stakes drama. Marcus stood outside the Grand Council chamber, flanked by Maria, Jamal, Terrence, and Annika. Each of them had played a vital role in uncovering the truth, and their presence was a quiet reminder of the strength Marcus had found in teamwork. "You ready for this?" Terrence asked, his voice steady. Marcus nodded. "It's not just my name on the line anymore. It's everyone's future." The chamber was packed with reporters, officials, and community members. The mayor sat alongside federal investigators, her expression tense but composed. At the center of the room, Marcus took his seat, prepared to deliver the most important testimony of his career. The lead council member, an older man with sharp eyes, began. "Captain Fields, we've reviewed the materials your team has uncovered. The evidence points to systemic corruption involving not just your precinct, but others across the city. Today, we ask that you present your findings and recommendations for moving forward." Marcus adjusted the microphone and began. "Thank you, council members, for this opportunity," he said, his voice carrying the weight of the moment. "What we uncovered is not just an isolated case of corruption. It's a pattern, one that has existed for years, protected by a culture of silence and fear." He outlined the key findings: financial records linking Howard Greaves to multiple precincts, evidence tampering orchestrated by Gary Hendricks, and connections to city officials who had profited from the scheme. The room fell silent as Marcus displayed a series of damning documents and photos on a large screen. Among them was the ledger recovered from the storage facility, showing bribes paid to officials and officers alike. The final slide displayed Gary's mugshot alongside a list of charges he faced. "Gary Hendricks acted as the enforcer," Marcus continued, "but this wasn't his scheme alone. It was a network, a system designed to prioritize profit over justice." The council members began their questions. One leaned forward. "Captain Fields, how can we ensure this doesn't happen again? What steps do you propose to rebuild trust?" Marcus's response was clear and deliberate. "First, we must establish independent oversight for all precincts. Second, we need to overhaul our training programs to focus on ethics, community engagement, and transparency. Finally, we must empower citizens to hold us accountable through review boards with real authority." His words drew murmurs of approval from the audience, but not everyone was convinced. A council member known for his ties to law enforcement unions challenged him. "Captain Fields, some argue these changes would weaken the police force. What do you say to that?" Marcus didn't flinch. "Accountability doesn't weaken us, it makes us stronger. If we can't earn the trust of the people we serve, we've already failed." As Marcus's testimony concluded, a commotion erupted in the back of the chamber. A man stood shouting, "This is all a setup. Fields is just trying to save himself by taking everyone else down." The man was instantly recognizable. Officer Daniels. The room buzzed with tension as security moved to escort him out. But Marcus raised a hand. "Let him speak," he said calmly. Daniels hesitated, then stepped forward. "You think you're a hero, Captain? You don't know what it's like out there, what we face every day." "You're right," Marcus replied, his voice steady. "I don't know what it's like to cut corners or abuse power to make my job easier, but I do know what it's like to do the right thing, even when it's hard. And so do you, because you've started to prove it." Daniels's expression softened, the anger in his eyes replaced by a flicker of doubt. He turned and walked out, leaving the room in stunned silence. After hours of testimony and questions, the council recessed to deliberate. Marcus stepped outside, where a crowd of supporters had gathered. Cheers erupted as he appeared, but Marcus raised his hand for quiet. "This isn't about me," he said, his voice carrying across the plaza. "It's about all of us. Today we took a step toward justice, but the work doesn't end here. Real change will take time, effort, and commitment from every one of us." The crowd roared in approval, their energy palpable. Later that evening, the council reconvened. The lead council member announced their decision. Effective immediately, we are implementing Captain Field's proposed reforms across all precincts. Independent oversight boards will be established, and federal investigations into implicated officials and officers will continue. The announcement was met with applause from the audience, and a wave of relief for Marcus and his team. As the night wore on, news broke that Gary Hendricks had attempted to strike a plea deal, offering additional information in exchange for a reduced sentence. Federal prosecutors declined, citing the overwhelming evidence against him. For Marcus, this was the final nail in the coffin of Gary's influence. That night, Marcus returned home to find Terrence waiting on the porch. "You did it," Terrence said, grinning. Marcus sat beside him, the weight of the day settling in. "We did it," he replied. The two brothers sat in silence, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. For the first time in months, Marcus allowed himself to feel a sense of peace. The days following the public hearing marked the beginning of a new chapter for Marcus Fields and the city he served. The council's decision to implement sweeping reforms sent a clear message. The days of unchecked corruption were over. But Marcus knew that implementing change was only the first step. The real challenge would be maintaining it. Back at the 6th Precinct, the atmosphere was cautiously optimistic. The Independent Oversight Board began reviewing old cases, unearthing long-buried complaints, and shining a light on misconduct that had once been ignored. Marcus's insistence on transparency earned him respect from newer recruits and officers like Jamal and Maria, but there were still murmurs of dissent among the old guard. One day, Daniels approached Marcus in the hallway. "Captain," he began awkwardly, "I wanted to say, thanks for not giving up on this place. And on me." Marcus studied him for a moment, then offered a small nod. "It's never too late to do the right thing." Daniels walked away, leaving Marcus with a glimmer of hope that even the most resistant officers could change. The Pathways to Trust program expanded, with officers actively engaging with schools, community centers, and local businesses. Marcus frequently visited these events, ensuring that the department's commitment to change wasn't just a slogan, but a lived reality. At one such event, Darius, the young activist who had challenged Marcus at the town hall, approached him. "You know," Darius said, his tone less combative than before, "I didn't think you'd follow through, but you've surprised me." Marcus smiled. "Accountability works both ways. Hold me to it, and I'll hold myself to it too." Darius extended a hand. "Deal." At home, Marcus found moments of quiet to reflect on the journey that had brought him here. The framed photo of his mother on his desk remained a source of strength. He often thought about her unwavering belief in him, the lessons she'd instilled about integrity and resilience. Terrence was a frequent visitor, their bond now stronger than ever. "You've come a long way," Terrence said one evening as they sat on the porch. "But you know this fight isn't over, right?" Marcus nodded. "It never is. But we've built something here, something worth fighting for." The broader impact of Marcus's work was beginning to show. Other precincts across the city adopted similar reforms, and discussions about systemic change echoed at the state level. Marcus received invitations to speak at conferences, sharing his experience and inspiring others to take a stand against corruption. One evening he stood at the precinct's entrance, watching as Maria and Jamal worked with a group of local teens on a community outreach project. The sight filled him with pride. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time in years Marcus felt like they were moving in the right direction. As the city lights twinkled in the distance, Marcus sat at his desk and opened a blank page in his notebook. At the top he wrote, "Trust is earned, not given. Leadership is action, not position. Justice is a responsibility we all share." He underlined the words, a quiet commitment to the work still to come. For Marcus, the battle for justice had started as a personal fight, but had grown into something far greater, a chance to redefine what it meant to serve and protect. And he was ready for the challenge. Months later, Marcus Fields stood in the bustling community center that had once been the site of protests. Today, it was filled with laughter and conversation as officers and residents mingled during a precinct-sponsored event. Jamal waved from across the room, flanked by a group of teenagers eager to show him their latest project. Maria was deep in discussion with a local pastor about expanding outreach programs. Marcus watched with quiet pride, the weight of his journey settling into resolve. The work was far from over, but the foundation had been laid. Together they were building something that would last. The story of Captain Marcus Fields is a testament to the power of integrity and perseverance in the face of systemic corruption and injustice. His journey shows us that standing up for what's right often comes at a great personal cost, but it's through those sacrifices that real change becomes possible. Marcus's fight wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about exposing a system that thrived on secrecy and inequality, and creating a blueprint for how accountability can rebuild trust. His leadership reminds us that transformation begins with individuals who dare to challenge the status quo and inspire others to do the same. But stories like Marcus's don't happen in isolation. They're the result of collective action, support, and courage from people willing to take a stand, whether on the front lines or behind the scenes. Each of us has the power to contribute to this kind of change in our own communities. Now, we want to hear from you. What did you think about Marcus's journey? How did his story resonate with you? Do you see parallels in your own life or community? Let's start a conversation. Share this story with your friends, family, and colleagues. Leave a comment below with your thoughts. What moved you, what surprised you, and what inspired you most? And don't stop there. Help amplify Marcus's message of justice and accountability by liking this post and sharing it with others. Together, we can create a ripple effect that extends far beyond this page. Your voice matters. Your actions matter. Join the movement for a better, more just world. Let's work together to build trust, foster accountability, and create communities where everyone feels protected and respected. Like, comment, and share now. Let's make this story a catalyst for change.